Hey, all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. It's Friday, September 2nd already. And I got to tell you, I have been waiting for this conversation for a long time. In fact, we waited all summer to have Mako Nagasawa on to talk about this fantastic book that he's written called Abortion. You wouldn't think a book about public policy would be so exciting, but a book on abortion policy and Christian social ethics has captured my heart, and super excited about this. Mako, thank you for writing the book and for talking with us about this today. It's so clear to so many of us that abortion as a social issue is not very well talked about. We've talked about a lot on our podcast how a lot of us don't know and don't want to talk about it. Like, you bring up the issue of abortion, and boy, people just want to stop talking about it as fast as they can. And you've spent a lot of time thinking about it from the public policy standpoint and as a Christian. So thanks for doing all this hard work on this great book, and also for being with us today.
Absolutely, Doug. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for, reading the book and being in this conversation with me. And yeah, I continue to learn a lot. This is uh, uh, obviously things have changed even since I published this with Whip and Stock last year. The book actually came out, believe it or not, on January 6th of 2021. So that that was just
It's a tough day,
that
tough
was
day to
a
get
tough
to
day.
catch the news, cycle. If people don't remember, that's the day that Donald Trump sent people to be part of an armed insurrection attacking the United States Capitol to try to stop the free and fair election from being certified. So,
Right,
January 6th is sort of a word that exists in our head, but let's also remember what that was about that particular day that was so
right,
devastating. And frankly, the issue of abortion was settled very deeply in that day. I mean, that was how some people, especially on the religious right, have thought about abortion, gave them the moral and ethical permission to act in the ways that we saw on January 6th, which I think they don't have the moral right to do, but they've interpreted it that way. They have said that
right.
they've had that right. They've thought that that was important to them. So it really matters. So thanks for this work. All right. In addition to being, an author of a tremendously helpful book on abortion policy and Christian social ethics, you're somebody that cares a lot about Christian ministry, Christian thought. Um, and later in the conversation, I want to ask you how you got into all of this and how you found yourself thinking about these issues and so on in your own Christian faith. But you also run the Anastasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry, and you're an elder at a church, and you do those kinds of things. So we'll talk about that in a bit. But let's jump right into it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yep.
pardon me. We have a little custom around here that I nearly forgot. We check in on the weather with our guests or co-hosts wherever we are. September 2nd. It's a beautiful day in Minneapolis. I'm pointing up because I'm in my basement, and outside it's another glorious day. We get a good run of weather around here. It's going to be mid 80s and pleasant. How is it where you are?
It's really good. I'm in Boston. We've had a lot of heat here recently, but today is in the 70s. It's sunny. There's a few small clouds in the sky, and a really nice breeze. So this is my favorite type of day.
Right.
Fall, as we head into fall, it's really my favorite season as well, because I grew up in California, in Los Angeles, and then the Bay Area, and we didn't really have seasons there. So
Right.
it still delights me to stay in one place and have the world change around me. Plus, we get your weather maybe 2 or 3 days after you do.
That's right.
So that's
That's
great to
right.
know what you're experiencing.
Well, that's very well said. One of the reasons we always check in on the weather is because it is one of those things that in many parts of our world does change, and we just are reminded that change happens. Change is
That's right.
sort of normative, at least when it comes to weather in most places in the world. And then we also know we share that in common, at least. There's a lot of things it feels like we don't share in common with our neighbors, but boy, you and your neighbor are under the same sky, at least, and experiencing the same, at least the same weather. So a little moment to remind yourself that we're all in this thing together, even though
That's right.
sometimes it can feel so much like we're so separated by so many things. All right. So, Mako, I know that you're not someone who wants to say, oh, let me tell you the answers to the question of what should our abortion policy be. You're more interested in helping people think about how to talk about the issues of abortion, Christian ethics, civic responsibility, collective thought.
Right.
So I won't get into, real quickly, like, hey, what do you think the answers to our abortion policies in the United States should be? But let me just kind of ask that. What do you think we should be doing about abortion in our country right now? Like, now that the Roe versus Wade has been overturned, it's been thrown back to these states. State legislators are having to make these decisions. It feels to me like things are more convoluted and more unsafe and unfair than they have been in 5 decades. Um, what what should and can we do about this?
Well, I think that there's a number of angles on this, and this is where, yeah, I think while I respect the terms pro-life and pro-choice, I personally feel like that's almost meaningless these days because there's so much nuance and in between intersecting policies. For example, positions on contraception, about economics, about a pronatal policy, and in economic um, policies. I think there's a basic question about, do we view this issue through a criminal justice lens or through a social welfare
Lens.
and public health lens, primarily. And then I think there's a smattering of issues kind of connected with uh, uh, fetal abnormalities and what produces those kinds of health effects. And I think we need to be thinking about and pursuing all of those things. And
Yeah.
so, I depending on which place you would like to start, Doug, I'm happy
Yeah.
to talk about any of those. And what I find is that as I address Christians in particular, especially those who kind of came of age thinking about this in the wake of the uh, basically Reagan's alliance with the religious right, and how this particular flavor of the anti-abortion movement has taken shape. Um, they're they're often surprised at how counterproductive
Mm,
their own policies are, right?
mm,
And so again, as you said, this is about social policy. This is not a book primarily about personal convictions or personal, like, well, what would I do if
mm-hmm,
um,
mm-hmm,
if this were in my family or something. This is about social policy and
mm.
what kind of principles can we work out from there. Um,
Well,
but
Mako,
I,
that
I'm
that
happy to talk
seems
about all.
Mako, that seems so important what you just said there, and I think a lot of people struggle with knowing how to think about these things, knowing how to think about the difference between their own personal understanding or their moral sense. I know a lot of people who say human personhood begins at the moment of conception, the moment of egg fertilization, and any destruction of that egg is considered the same as the death of any human being. So if it's inflicted intentionally by another person, you call it murder, right? There's that. People believe
Right,
that wholeheartedly. I don't hold that view. I think that's a view that doesn't stand up to the weight of what we mean by personhood at all in our society or in our morals or in our religion, for you and I as Christians and for many other
right,
religions. But a lot of people do. So wherever they are on their own personal view of personhood and life and so on, some people really struggle with knowing what to do with their own personal convictions as they relate to public policy. Right.
right,
So, like, it's like I do a lot of work around capital punishment and I want capital punishment to stop. I think it's morally wrong. I think it's wrong for the government. I do a lot of work around border issues. I think it's wrong that we tell people who are seeking asylum in the United States they have to wait in Mexico and we have limits on who can come. That's driven out of personal ethical, belief, but also out of something that is a part of our civic engagement. And
right,
for someone to have to know when can you stop your own personal convictions demands and begin a public policy demand, that's very difficult for people to do. And you, as somebody who thinks a lot about Christian ethics and public spaces, how do you help people know how to think about that? Because you don't want someone to, you're not suggesting, oh, be ethics free or be morals free, right?
that's right,
But somewhere your stance on your own personal morals are going to impact what you think public policy is going to be. But we can't simply run around saying whatever my personal morals are now need to be reinforced by law. So
right.
how do you help people think about things such as this?
Great question, Doug. And I think you started with uh, the conviction that many people have that personhood begins with conception. And it surprises many people to learn that actually the Bible doesn't say that, and that early Christian tradition and uh, for a long time recognized that. And so I could start there, but in general, I'm interested in helping people know the contours of uh, the the issues as they intersect with each
Mm,
other, and also what are the limits that I,
mhm,
as a Christian, uh, believe exist on like the types of policies that we could have. And so, for instance, Exodus 21 is the single most important biblical text on the subject because it
mm,
deals with the moral weight of the fetus. Now, and right away, I know a lot of people who would just go to Psalm 139 or Jeremiah 1 or other places where Scripture poetically says, like, God knew me in my mother's womb, and so it's believed by some that they could take that thought all the way back to the moment of conception. And um, in reality, that's not the most faithful way to deal with it, because in Exodus 21 we have this actually stock situation that comes up in the ancient Near East pretty often, which is a pregnant woman gets struck and the fetus that she's carrying dies, and there's the additional question of like, well, is she hurt by this? Is she
mm.
injured bodily in addition to having the miscarriage? Right. This situation comes up in the Code of Hammurabi as well. I guess it was a stock situation, and what happens in Exodus 21 is that uh, that the fetus is not treated with full personhood um, in the Hebrew Masoretic text, which and then there's a difference between the Greek Septuagint translation, which it takes a little bit more discerning stance, but essentially about the fetus. But essentially, already we have this incredible. I suppose you could say it's a disagreement, but I think that there's a way they could coexist. But the Hebrew and the Greek manuscripts of this passage, which were used together at the same time by
Mm.
Jewish synagogues, like for 200 years prior to Jesus and during the time of Jesus, they were used together. The Greek Septuagint had the basic stamp of approval by the ruling body of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem of like, yeah, this is how we think about it. Um, so the Hebrew Masoretic says birth and breath constitute full personhood for the fetus, and but the Greek Septuagint says formation versus uh, imperfect formation, or being not
Mm.
completely formed. That's the moment where we should think about the fetus as having the moral weight of personhood. But even with that, I mean, there's questions of what did that mean to them, and how do we interpret that today? So it's really surprising then that the early Christians actually recognized what's I should say it's surprising. It was surprising to me, and it's maybe surprising to most Christians today to learn that the early Christians recognized, hey, there's a manuscript difference here. We don't totally know what to do,
Mm.
um, and so they looked to Greek science,
Mm.
and some folks went with Galen and Hippocrates and said, okay, well, the fetus, even though that is complicated because they believe that the father's sperm contained the fully formed human being, uh, and the
The,
mother
the
just
biology
provided.
was a bit off, perhaps we
Right,
might be
right,
reminded.
right. And so Hippocrates, the doctor, said that's why we don't perform abortions, because we don't want to interrupt that. But Aristotle said no, like he observed miscarriages happen, and so he looked at them and actually tried to do something scientific and said there's a period of not being fully formed, and then there's a point at which the fetus looks human, and so we'll just call that formed.
Hmm.
And so that seems to be the basic agreement with the Greek Septuagint as well. But Yeah. I
Yeah, and
mean,
I want to settle in on this for a bit because I think it's worth talking about. For people that don't know about Hebrew manuscripts and Septuagint,
yeah,
the what we call the Bible has two big sections to it. One of them is the Jewish Bible, which is what Christians refer to as the Old Testament. And then you have the New Testament. Those were not written in English, right? And the Hebrew
right,
Bible was written in a certain language, Hebrew language, maybe even an earlier language, but then into Hebrew, and then translated into Greek for
which
Greek
agree.
speaking people. That's what the Septuagint translations are. And every time there's been a translation of the Bible from any language to any other language, interpreters have to make judgment calls on what words are used. It's not just one for one, right? We see that
Right,
happen quickly if you use an iPhone or something and it translates to another language for you. But even there, the algorithm has built into it a whole set of assumptions. And those sets of assumptions end you up sometimes with differences between the language. So what you're suggesting is that even in the, 2000 BC, including the time of Jesus and 1,000 years after Jesus and now 2,200 years after, or 2,000 years after Jesus, we're still living in a period of time where interpretations of text is in play. And that's not a cop out. I think this is important to note. That's
right,
not you saying, so therefore, what do we have? Well, we don't have anything. But rather, I think what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong here, you're saying, look, human beings have struggled with this question all along. They've tried to go to their text and to say, what does the text say? And that's been different. And then they've said they go to their community, the rabbis in the synagogue or the teachings of the church, and that has differed, or they went to philosophy or they went to doctors. So
right,
we don't have any point, and a lot of people think that the Christian teaching on abortion is settled, it's consistent, and knowable. And therefore, then they can agree with it or disagree with it, right? So people that are Christian or not Christian can just say, like, hey, well, the Christian teaching on abortion is X, and I hold it, or I disagree, or I want to adapt or something. I think what you're reminding us of, that's maybe not the best way to think about what the Christian
right.
text or the Christian history or Christian tradition says, that it has been complicated. And so, therefore, we're talking about a complex moral issue that's informed by certain information, but isn't simply derived from it. So, you
Right.
can't say something as simple as, well, you should love your neighbor. I mean, not a lot of ways to mess around with that one. Maybe there's a few, and we'll bicker about who our neighbor is. God love us, we'll do that. They've been doing that since, the first uttering of love your neighbor. But it's pretty clear. Things like, when does personhood or ensoulment, when does a soul come into a human being, or when is a person a
Yeah.
person? Look, people have been struggling with this for a long time, and they think, well, what did Jesus say on it? So I'll pose that question to you just real quickly, because I hear this a lot from people, like, well, what did Jesus say about abortion? So Mako, as
Yeah.
far as you've understood all these things in your deep study, abortions were happening at the time of Jesus. It was big
Absolutely.
political, big social, big ethical issue. What does Jesus say to his followers about abortion?
Well, there's no recorded statement about Jesus talking about abortion, so we don't know, and and to your point, like the issue of, so then we have to look at, well, what was the Bible that Jesus was reading? Because presumably he agreed with it, but even there we don't know because we have a manuscript that in two different forms, and but in neither form, in neither the Hebrew nor the Greek, does it indicate that the fetus should be given personhood from conception, right? It's either birth or formation. So the Hebrew Masoretic seems to land on the imagery of God breathing, and then the baby breathing in the breath of life. And Adam's formation in Genesis 2 was taken as somewhat
Mm-hmm.
archetypal of, like, when the breath of life enters the lungs, then
Mm-hmm.
that's a living being. Um, and then the Greek as the marker, and
Yeah.
and so it's formation.
So Mako, is
So
it, look, I mean, I don't agree with the life begins at fertilization or conception argument. That's not the view that I
yeah,
hold. Having said that, knowing that the Christian history, the Jewish faith history, other traditions histories have had competing ideas that have been informed by different data, text data, community data, scientific data. Isn't it a legitimate version that someone would say, well, look, okay, there's been disagreements, but now, based on what I know, what I read, the community I hang around with, we're now not going to use birth and breathing in of air or formation at a certain level of development, the two that you'd suggested, but we want to introduce a third, and that is fertilization. We now know things, these people will argue. We now have a different ethical standards. We have a way of understanding that's different. So we have different data and different way of thinking about it. So let's offer a new one. And I
Yeah,
hear these folks saying, okay, here's a new one. Now my view is, okay, fair enough, but don't say that that view you hold is not a new one. Don't try to claim it as an old one or as the first one or as the only one, but go ahead and suggest it as a new one, because that's what we've seen from tradition, right? And from text is different communities at different times have answered this question differently. So it seems to me it's fair that someone makes this argument. I want to suggest a new one, right? Because sometimes I hear people say, whoa, the biblical view is breath only. They've heard this from Jewish rabbis and others in the Jewish
yeah,
faith, and therefore they want to say, oh, you think the original, biblical view is conception, but no, it's actually birth, so therefore let's go with birth. That doesn't work in my mind very well. I don't think most people are like, well, what was a 7,000-year-old version of this thing? Like, I want to think modern language,
sure.
new science. I was arguing with some people about this issue at a Trump rally thing, and they said to me, well, science has changed. I thought you were all pro science. Why don't you take the new scientific theory on this? So I get where they're coming from, right? I
Yeah.
disagree, but they're making a point. Is what I've suggested here a fair point as far as you've studied it, that in the 20th and 21st century, people can make a new suggestion about the moral, ethical demand on people of faith and thinking about the issue of abortion? Is that fair, even though it's not, claiming all biblical authority for it?
Well, I think it's a fair question to ask, and I think it's a good suggestion to wrestle with. The thing is demarcating which is what you're actually doing, what people are actually doing, as opposed to conflating it into the biblical text or conflating it with Jewish and or Christian tradition. And also there's other principles at stake, moral
Hmm.
principles that are valid. For example, freedom of religion, which is a Christian principle, right? Like Jesus calls his followers based on their voluntary decisions to follow him, and forms a community. And he demarcates in Matthew 19 and another a whole bunch of other places, like Christians should not expect non-Christians to be able to agree with
Hmm.
or live out the standards, the moral and ethical standards that Christians are called to live out. However, there must be some places of agreement, and and so that's where we get into these things. So, for instance, uh, respecting Jewish freedom of religion, I think is a really important issue. I mean, especially after the 20th century, especially after the Christians by and large have kind of woken up to all the atrocities that Christians have committed against Jewish communities. Like I would want to give as much benefit of the doubt to Jewish
Hmm.
um, ways of thinking and ethics as I possibly can,
Hmm.
including on this issue. And so, yeah, there's the majority Jewish tradition that says that still says birth and breath, and there are other Jewish considerations there. Uh, but do I simply want to trample over a Jewish assertion to be able to live out their faith? I I don't think so. I wouldn't do that. Um, Now, in regards to conception, I mean, I think it's a fair personhood at conception. It's a fair question to ask. But if we are going to follow the lead of the early Christians and say, well, let's look at science too, then I don't think we would actually. I think the case is weak,
Hmm.
if not impossible, that personhood begins at conception. And that is because of what embryology now tells us about the early embryo, the way it's formed, and for example, cell potency or twinning and recombination, like chimerism is something I talk about in the book of like
Hmm.
the possibility that you could actually have the DNA of your twin, even though the DNA that you present to the world is kind of what we consider you. There's a twin inside, and we know that happens. We don't know exactly how often, but that poses a problem for Christian
Right.
theology,
Right.
uh, because we think that the soul is the principle of individuality, and so if two twins recombine in the womb, which happens very early,
Hmm.
then I think it begs the question, when does ensoulment happen? Which we can't observe scientifically. It's just that we observe what's happening with the
Right.
embryo or embryos, and then we kind of have to reason out from there. When is it possible, or when does it seem stable enough for God to ensoul the
Hmm.
embryo? For different
Y-
reasons, I think it's just much more palatable and logical to
Yeah.
say that let's look at the brain and the nervous system. I mean, and say, well, what's happening there with the embryo? Because beginning of life care and end of life care, I think, can be coordinated and should be coordinated, because at end of life care, if I lose my hand, there's no question that I'm still a person, legally, socially. But if I lose my nervous system, there are no brain waves happening. Then there
Yeah.
would be a question of like, well, what am I then? And what is the responsibility of my loved ones to my body? Um, I don't want to get into that. I'm just simply showing that there's a
Uh,
minimum condition, right, of functioning nervous system and brain waves that seem to matter. And so, at 40 to 43 days, brain waves are detected in the fetus. Um, Even the earliest, I think, really hardcore pro-life position could take is 23 days. That's when the brain and nervous system are formed. But 40 to 43 days is where the brain waves can be detected. So what if that is the marker of ensoulment? I mean, from
Yeah.
a functional perspective.
Yeah. And what you're raising, I think, is so helpful. And a lot of people don't talk about this. And
Yeah,
so oftentimes in abortion conversations, um, we're put into one conversation or the other. And today we've had a lot of conversation about the nature of the developing fetus and, you know, if development continues, human being inside of a mother's womb. We're not having as much of a conversation now, we will in a moment, about the mother who's
right,
inhabiting the spaces that this fetus is developing in. But sometimes people only have conversations about the mother. Other times people only want to have conversations about the fetus. Sometimes people want to have conversations about both. It gets really complicated, but those are two continuums that people know how to talk about. This other language that we're using here, though, could be new to some people. So I want to spend a
yeah,
little moment on it. And that is the whole notion of personhood or ensoulment, or when is the person a person? Because the language that has been used has been the language of life. When
right,
does life begin? Well, cellular life is all around us, right? An
right.
amoeba that's moving is life, right? So,
Hmm.
but when we're talking about particular human life, what we really mean is not is there cellular action or even is there electrical impulse, or sorry, electrical pulses going on in the brain or in the heart? Is there some electrical system running? But is the person a person? Is there a person there?
Right,
And that's not a new conversation. We just have new ways of talking about it. And so I have found it helpful to think about, as you raised, both end of life and beginning of life as the place where we try to understand this. So if anyone's been in the terrible situation of having to make a determination that a person be taken off of life support because they're no longer there,
right,
what we're not saying is, oh, is there a heartbeat? Are there some brain waves? Are cells multiplying? Yes, they are. But we know that the person is gone, has died, is dead, and is only being kept alive by these other functions and features.
That's right.
Well, does that imply and apply? I think it does to a mother's body being the other feature that's keeping development happening, but it's not able to live on its own. And this was the argument around Roe versus Wade, is this idea of viability, which then was 24 weeks and moved to 20 weeks. Some people wanted 15 weeks, so we're going to argue about the number of weeks. But viability had this sense of like, well, now there's independence or could be independence for, and that became an important date to sort of find a place in the gradation
Right.
between inception and, the what we would call full personhood. But this
Hmm.
whole idea of personhood, Mako, I hear very few people talking about it. Strangely, the only people I hear talking about it are people on the extreme pro-life side of the argument. It's been very
Right.
interesting. And then a few ethicists like that talk about it. But with progressive liberals like me who are pro-choice, it's rarely talked about. Rarely does somebody bring up personhood, or they even say like, well, we don't know the answer to that, and one person we know in this situation is the woman, and let's keep our focus there. I totally understand that too, right?
Yeah.
If you have a fetus and a person, and the person is going to die because of complications with the fetus, then the moral question is clear: you protect the person. If you have two persons, then what do you do? And it gets complicated, on that front. But this these are the ethical things that we have to struggle with. Can you say something about any of that long ramble I just went on there, and about these terms and the concepts of personhood versus life, and all the rest of it?
Yes, absolutely. Again, in Exodus 21, it's clear that there is a way that the biblical text itself would make a differentiation between life and personhood. So as you said, human life is what's genetically human, right? The DNA, and or at least in the fetus, that sense, it is a human life, but is it a human person? And in Exodus 21, there is the language of, well, if there is harm done, then the consequence to the assailant is an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, and what that means is a whole question by itself. I don't think it simply means reciprocal damage. I think it it means here's the outer limit for compensation for bodily harm. But but in any case, that phrase is used uh, to indicate this is a person. And when a person injures a person, then the consequence is, yeah, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. In some ways, it's best understood as, if I hurt your eye, I become your second eye,
Hmm.
right? Like I
Wow.
help out until you're healed, or I compensate you for the loss of your eye. So if I hurt your eye, I become your second eye. It's an eye for an eye. I understand it means something different in the Code of Hammurabi, but even that it seems to be debated by scholars who study that time period, and it's a very interesting conversation. What we
Hmm.
know in Jewish law is it's more restorative justice and not retributive justice.
Hmm.
So that principle is applied
Hmm.
to the mother for certain, the pregnant woman, and in the case of the Greek Septuagint, it's applied to the fetus if it is fully formed. So, and it's not applied if the fetus is imperfectly formed or unformed. Interestingly enough, in Psalm 139, King David also talks about, I was once unformed and then I was formed. So even Psalm 139 makes that critical
Hmm.
distinction. And so the difference between life and personhood can be seen in the biblical text. And it's really important as we try to grapple with it today. Of course, a fetus is human life, it has human DNA. But is it a human person? Well, if we're to be fully consistent with that, then any pregnant woman should be able to drive in the what multi the fast lane,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And there are some cases, I mean, where a fetus has property rights, like if
Mm,
I know situations sadly there's mass shootings where a mother and a fetus who was like 7 or 8 months along were both
hmm.
killed, and that counted as two deaths. But on the other hand, I mean, there are other situations where the fetus is not counted as a person, because primarily it's too early to do that. So IVF clinics don't count,
Yeah.
right? Like persons living at their address. Most churches don't have funerals for miscarriages. We don't report that
Yeah.
as deaths. Those are medical events. They're significant. I don't want to downplay how heartbreaking that could be, but they're not. We don't treat them as deaths of persons. It's just too early. And it's striking that 50 to 70% of all fertilized eggs don't even implant in the mother's uterus. So if we were to say that ensoulment and personhood starts at the moment of conception, then we would have to call God the greatest abortionist simply because of the rate of non-implantation. So
Right.
these things just don't make sense, and uh, to and it indicates there is a meaningful difference between human life and human personhood.
Yeah, and that is so important. Again, we're talking about this book that Mako has written, Abortion Policy and Christian Social Ethics, and it's got 3 sections to it. That if you're interested in all this, um, Mako is a great guide for you to start moving your way through this. So, okay, it's complicated. It has been
Yeah,
complicated for a long time, and it's complicated in the way that all moral issues around how should people treat one another are complicated. So we
right,
know that. But in light of that, we got to do something, right? You can't
right.
not have a policy about this. It's a big enough, important enough thing that we're going to have a policy, even if the policy is there's no policy, which we're not going to have. I'm one who doesn't advocate for that. I
Yeah,
think there is a point where personhood needs to be considered with a child at 34 weeks or, in the birthing process. Nowhere in the country does anyone are you allowed to terminate that pregnancy. Like we have laws that say you can't terminate a pregnancy after a certain date. And those dates are now movable. And some states they're making those dates conception, and some states are making those dates 22 weeks or 24 weeks or 20 weeks. But there's a limit, right? And then
right.
any medical condition that's causing the need for the termination of a pregnancy after that point has to meet certain ethical and moral standards. You can't just do as Donald Trump, I referred to him as the former failed president and failed presidential candidate, and twice impeached, said that, well, now in states you can call for an abortion while you're giving birth. No, you can't. It's ridiculous. It's a lie. It's just nonsense, and it's designed to make people think that there's just barbarian-like activities going on with people who want to support the laws that protect the birthing person and not just the one being born. So there's very sophisticated systems that have to come in place. Sometimes that put women's lives in jeopardy. And if people are watching this podcast or in live stream, you can go back through our playlist. We've had conversations with women who've been in these situations, and what they're worried about is that their own lives would have been lost if they lived in states that now have rules that limit abortion, even under medical conditions, because they had to make decisions within hours because of what had happened when they were 24 or 25 weeks along in pregnancy and the pregnancy ended and they needed to terminate that no longer viable pregnancy in order for them to live. That's what we're talking about. So you're going to have laws, is what I'm getting at.
Yes.
So how, Mako, do we have laws when this is all so it's been complicated for, as you've said, in other countries, in other traditions, in other worlds, in other times, and it seems equally as complex now. How do we set social policy around these issues?
So the first question that arises tends to be contraception, uh, and I there are and the reason to think about the early formation of the embryo is because there is a lot of well-meaning Christians and other conservatives who believe I have to vote against IUDs, like intrauterine devices, because that is the kind of contraception, or the RU486 morning after pill, that can cause an abortion. And they define that as, well, there's a fertilized egg, and maybe it hasn't implanted in the mother's uterus yet, or maybe it just has, but the contraception causes the dislodging of that embryo, right? Or it causes or prevents the embryo from implanting. And on that grounds, and this is the kind of thing that happens within the first few days. Um, and on that grounds, they say, well, I can't vote for that in good conscience. I mean, I think one of the first things that my research led me to conclude is that no, actually, you can vote for that in good conscience. And that's really important because especially long-lasting birth control like IUDs are the most effective way of bringing down the abortion rate. It's the most effective way of helping poor women, women of color especially, because it is long-acting. And um, if we had better contraceptive care consistently, then we would see dramatic reductions in the abortion rate. We did see
Interesting.
a lowering of the abortion rate from the Affordable Care Act. So from 2010 to 2016, there's a lot of, and up to now, there's a lot of good data that shows a much more rapid decline in the abortion rate. There was a slow decline before for a few years, but the the rate was much more rapid, and that's hopeful because contraceptive care is something that we could do more of, and
Right, and
it's
we
it's
both
really
we both know
unfortunate.
how complicated this gets, right? Because one of the religious traditions in the United States, that's Roman Catholicism,
Yes.
which has done a lot of advocating about not allowing abortions to be part of the legal structure, also have a religious teaching that prohibits contraception, that
That's right.
to use sex in a way that would definitively not allow for procreation is the misuse of sex. So therefore, so that religious teaching um, is one that, while not enshrined in law, even though Supreme Court Justice Thomas has suggested that perhaps contraception is one that needs to be looked at again under a privacy statute or
Yeah.
privacy reading of the Constitution. Setting that particular, is there going to be a time when contraception is not allowed in some states in this country? There's social religious pressure that basically equates contraception with abortion. And while maybe not on moral grounds, certainly on religious teaching. So, in other
Yeah.
words, the same church that demands that abortions not be performed also demands that contraceptions not be used. So, when someone's rooting their faith into their public policy, well, then there's a lot of social pressure for people not to receive contraception. And there was even a court case, the Hobby Lobby case, that allowed for this company that's selling, hobby gear and model airplanes to not have to allow their employees to receive medical health insurance benefits if it includes contraception. So we have these insertions where some people's religion allows them to live under different laws in this country. And I don't know how we manage. I know we're not talking fully about religious freedom versus ethical demand, but you can't talk about abortion and contraception in this country without also talking about what do we do about religious freedom and where its boundaries are. It just
Right.
puts you into a tangled up mess. It's like when you try to unravel the cords under your desk and you're like, I can't even find where that cord begins and the other one ends. I don't know what I'm unplugging at this point. It
That's
feels
right.
that way to people where they don't even want to talk about this stuff because they don't know. It seems overly arcane and complicated, and they don't know where to go. But these are real issues. We're going to decide, like, whose religion is going to have the protections of the government and whose religion is going to feel like it's being overrun by the government.
Right. Well, I mean, but when we understand it that way, doesn't it give away the game? I mean, the the issue is if your religion tells you, and I mean, I spend a chapter and a half talking about
Yeah.
contraception. I didn't I didn't think when in starting off writing this book that I would have to, but I kept coming up against, yes, the Roman Catholic and to some degree, Eastern Orthodox uh, understanding of marriage, sex, contraception. So I take it on uh, head on, and I would say first of all, I mean, to your point, even if I can go into the arguments, but even if you're not persuaded by my arguments, no one's stopping you from not using contraception, right? Like,
That's right.
there, this, your freedom of religion is not being um, invaded. It's actually your religious view of marriage, sex, and contraception that you are seeking to impose on other people.
Yeah.
Is that fair? And especially when you look at the facts that, well, the reason why this came about was questionable, right? Like, number one, it had to do with an assumption that the father's sperm contained the whole human being, and the mother simply provided the incubation
Hmm.
and the
Hmm.
nourishment. Yeah, I guess if you believe that, then you would be against contraception. You
Right.
would be against a whole bunch of like masturbation and a whole bunch of things, because that would be
Right.
a
Which
moral question.
the Catholic Church in many of its teachings is specifically, against that, to the point that, there's jokes about if you masturbate as a male, you're going to go blind because it was some curse of God that was going to, because you were spilling your seed inappropriately. Like, you're not
That's
just
right.
being
That's right.
facetious about this. This actually is part of the moral ethical teaching in some Catholic contexts, maybe all Catholic
It,
contexts.
it is, at least on paper, right? I mean, on the ground, who knows? But and then the other reason is at some point the church wanted to honor singleness so much and celibacy, which I affirm. I mean, there's
Right.
and I admire that, but they did so by saying the only difference then between married people and single people is the ability to make children. And so not even your
Mm.
sexual desire for your spouse was a legitimate reason to have sex. In other words, sex couldn't serve simply to express the love and concretize the covenant, the marriage covenant between husband and wife. It had to be open to produce children. And so that's the functional difference between single people
Mm.
and married people. I
Right.
think that was a mistake. That was an overreach, and I demonstrate how that came about and why it is that, for example, Catholic scholar John Noonan said we should revisit this, and he submitted a proposal to the
Yeah.
Vatican II conference. It was not accepted, but his reasoning was valid, and so, eh, boy, yes, it's complicated,
It's
Doug,
complicated.
but the thing is, from uh, from a certainty versus uncertainty standpoint, because it relates to policy, it's not complicated. People should vote for contraceptive care in
Yeah.
good conscience, and that would dramatically bring down the abortion rate.
So in
I
20
mean,
plus states, people who are elected to the state legislature, which is an honorable role, in a lot of places, it's nearly, if not fully, a volunteer function where you're paid a small stipend for the time and energy and cost that it takes to be a state representative or state senator. They're being asked now to draw up policies and to vote on policies about abortion and contraception and myriad issues around them. And I only bring up that they're volunteers because they're not signing up for this, or at least in the past, people didn't sign up saying, "Oh, what I now have to do is to engage deep ethical questions that are, we're only talking about a fraction of the complexity of what goes on with all of this, right?"
right.
And it's already outside of most people's scope to even think about. So it's so much easier to just say life begins at birth or life begins at conception and kind of leave it at that. But that's not sufficient when you're having to set policy. And it's not sufficient when a person has to make a determination should they continue a pregnancy or not. I know people who've made that decision, have chosen not to continue their pregnancies. And in all the situations I know, it was not a casual, flippant decision at all. It, there were many people and many factors involved, but it's never just clear and clean and clinical. And sometimes when I hear people say it's between a woman and her doctor, it's almost as if they're conjuring up a person alone inside of a doctor's office. And look, I'm not a woman. I have never had a gynecologist, but I know women who have. And I'll just tell you, most women are like, I'm not that close to my gynecologist. Like, what are you talking about? Like, this is the only person of course, they're not only talking to their gynecologist. They're talking to their friends, their parents, their history. They're talking maybe, to people who've passed on in prayer. Like, they're just doing everything they can to root themselves in this kind of question. So, should we have should there be some public policy limitations that are in place, uh, from your vantage point, as you've thought about all these things? Like, is it reasonable to say at certain weeks of development, abortion is no longer available to someone unless there's extenuating circumstances that have to do with the health of the mother or something like this? Or do you think it can and should be conditional? How have you come down on this as a person who's thought a lot about it, considering all these poor state legislators that are like, are you kidding me? Like,
That's right.
I'm a school teacher, or I run the bank, or I'm a person that runs my small business, and now I'm just helping out the state legislature, and now I've got to read all this stuff about ethics of when does personhood begin versus ensoulment versus like I don't know how to think about all this stuff.
It is overwhelming, Doug, and I will say I don't think I don't have one position on abortion policy. I have a lot of contingencies, right? I
Okay.
mean, I have a lot of considerations and values. So for example, in the book, I express profound discomfort with the abortion of Down syndrome um, fetuses. Uh, and I know other countries for which that seems to be quite normal. Iceland is one, and there are others, but I'm personally uncomfortable with it. But even with that, I think there would have to be some assessment of, well, are there social services available to parents,
Mm.
especially single mothers, if they're trying to parent a Down syndrome baby kid? That's hard, and I mean it's hard to be a parent just by itself. And so, we need to see uh, some continuum of care put in
Mm.
place
Mhm.
before we say, well, you have to bring that uh, fetus to term, give it birth, and raise the child. I mean, that's something that Basil of Caesarea in the fourth century seemed to think with regards to economic
Mm.
well-being. He actually said, infanticide is, speaking for Christians in the church context, infanticide is a sin, like abandoning an infant after it's born. That is a sin. And there was some kind of church discipline process that was happening, and he was part of that conversation um, for Christians. But when it came to poverty, he said, um, but we can understand if like a child dies
Mm.
of hunger in the home or something like that. No one is to be blamed because the extenuating circumstances were just too hard. uh, so that is an example of how the early Christians viewed
Mm.
the fetus and the child in the continuum of care, and they looked at the whole situation pastorally, and they were trying to say, look, there's a lot of moral considerations,
Mm. Yeah.
uh, and so I don't know. I put out some proposals about trying to hold men
Mhm.
more accountable, which are the most delicate, I think, and the most uncertain. Like I myself feel the most uncertain about them. Can we do a DNA test on every fetus that is aborted? In effect, can abortion be legal for the mother, legal for the doctor, and illegal for the father, and punishable with a fine? Well, I mean, that's an idea that I've
Mm.
had, but there's been no situation in which that's been really tested. We do know that we can run DNA tests on every fetus. We do that in cases of rape to determine
Yeah.
uh, you know, the fatherhood question, and so we know it can be done, but I don't know if there's the political will to do it. And the biggest question is, how do healthcare providers and how do abortion providers actually feel about policies like this? Because they're
Yeah,
the most
yeah,
impacted.
right.
Uh, and and we just don't know. So yeah, I mean, there are ideas that I'm willing to entertain. There are other ideas that I'm not willing to entertain
Mm.
because of moral principle, because of Christian principles, I believe, and uh, and I just kind of go in that direction. So I think that I genuinely have an openness to try to
Mm.
figure things out. Uh, I think it makes sense to have some kinds of limits. Western European countries, even France, ostensibly a secular country, has limits on I forget now exactly where they're at, um,
Hmm.
how many weeks, 12, 15, but essentially, and it's available, and I think that the majority of Americans seem to be okay with reluctantly making abortion legal for the first trimester. Um, but there's a moral cost. The later we go, there's a potential moral injury to doctors as well, and so we need to think about that. So
One of the arguments that's come up in the chat that goes on here on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and so on while we're talking,
yeah,
and you hear it a lot, is politicians shouldn't be making rules about what women do with their bodies. I totally understand that impulse. I think I understand what someone means when they say that. But of course, we do make laws that impact everyone's bodies. And we just, social policy does this kind of thing. It determines all manner of things that are appropriate and inappropriate from where we can put our bodies and what we can put in our bodies and what we do with other people with our body. Like we're doing this
right.
stuff all the time. So, but I understand what they're saying when it's specifically in the case of what happens with a pregnancy. How do you think about this whole issue, just social policy more generally? Like if you start to apply these principles that we say in one situation across the board, it gets difficult, right? To say like,
Yeah,
well, so our social policies just going to have nothing to do with what people do with their own bodies, which could be true. We may end up in a world in which there's a more libertarian view of all things, and it's like, hey, there are no rules about your own body, only about somebody else's body. And then, of course, people who believe that there's a separate person involved in the situation would have a different argument. Um, but we do this, don't we? Aren't we going to continue to have policies about this, whether it's from mundane things like what can be sold and drugs that can be taken, or seatbelts that are worn, or private property lines, or I mean, there's just all kinds of things that we do about what people do with their bodies. How
that's right.
can and should we make these social policy decisions about abortion, of course, but even more broadly, because it feels like that's really what we're talking about some days.
Right. I think we have to look at the full range of issues that kind of have some impact on pregnant women and the fetus, and perhaps the developing child, and say, well, let's try to be somewhat consistent. So, for instance, there are a lot of, I'll just say, for people on the left to be thinking about corporations that wind up sticking chemicals into women's bodies, like through pollution, or I mean, we feel strongly about that, and I do, and that I think that's especially tragic. I mean, it's been shown, for instance, that women who live in communities that are next to highways and
Yeah.
they breathe in lots of carbon monoxide, their babies are, which they want. These are the babies that they want to have. Those babies are more likely to have spina bifida, uh, profound birth defects. They're probably on the autism spectrum, or the probability of being on the autism spectrum is higher, and all these things. Are we prepared to say, well, none of that matters? There is no corporate liability for these kinds of things? Because, well,
Right.
if a woman does it, it's the same as if a corporation does it. Well, no, I don't think by and large most people are willing to do that, including the social libertarians.
Yeah.
So I, again, I think we need to put all of these issues on the table and try to work out our feelings, our best thoughts about that, because the abortion hits at any kind of dependent care hits at the weakness of the Enlightenment framework. And the Western Enlightenment framework stresses the autonomous individual. And we run into problems all the time when the individual is not autonomous, or when it's unclear that it's an individual.
Hmm.
So, um, and that's just the reality. So I
Yeah.
respect the social libertarian who is, you know, individuality first and other harm. Um, yes, we can have policies regulating other harm, but not self-harm. But in these cases, the the mother and the fetus are sharing a body, or at least
Yeah.
sharing an experience. And so the the distinction is not very easy to draw. And if we are trying to have uh, children not be plagued by fetal alcohol poisoning or carbon monoxide poisoning or other forms of poisoning, then I think we do need to think about policies like
Yeah.
this.
Yeah. It's really, well, you can see why people say, I just can't talk about this. I don't know.
Right.
I'm lost in this conversation. I can see, people that are listening to this podcast and they're like, wow, you people just know how to go like way deep. I had to rewind that thing. I don't know what they're even talking about at some point. You can see how complicated this is. And we have to acknowledge that, look, we have certain issues in our society for which our laws are insufficient and they don't match any of our personal beliefs or moral call or any of the rest of it. There's a whole lot of things I think we shouldn't be doing as a country that I don't get to have my way. And I know people that have other issues that they think should be handled differently, and they don't just get to have their way. But somewhere along the line, through some version of representative form of democracy, we elect people that we wanted, and then they are going to pass certain laws by certain, that's informed by certain information that they have. And it's always insufficient. So our social policy and our ethical dreams and demands and beliefs rarely match up, into a single Venn diagram, right?
That's right.
It's always going to be missing. And that doesn't mean we don't try. And figuring out how to try is a
Right.
really tough thing, especially for Christians who have been taught, and some of the audience that we like to speak to here, because I'm a former pastor and all that stuff. Because as a Christian person, people are told your religious belief is the way that it is because it's from God, and therefore it's right for humanity. It's good for humanity. It's ethical. It's moral. And so, how do you take that moral viewpoint, religious moral viewpoint, and insert it into the public sphere, as we talked about earlier? That's not an easy thing. Christian nationalism is one version. I think it's a really bad version that we take the Christian ethic and we make it the baseline for our public policy and public life. Alternatives to it for a lot of people feel very vague and very,
Yeah.
very difficult. So feel free to say something about that. And then also tell us, like, okay, Mako, who are you and how'd you get into all this? Like, what are you doing writing a 370-page book on abortion policy and Christian social ethics? What brought you to this stage, and what got you here?
Well, briefly, I wanted to be when I was in college, I thought about being a teacher, then principal, then policymaker in education, because of the actual complexities of the public sphere and the private sphere,
Hmm.
right? And education is kind of a hybrid. It touches those things, and that kind of thinking has always fascinated me, and I thought, yeah, it's important to be responsible to that. You know,
Oh, sorry for the little pause there. We just have a little glitch in the matrix. I don't know what's happening, but there's a little freeze frame going on. Well, hey friends, be sure you take a look at
the
Mako's. Hey, sorry,
Oh,
Michael. We had a little frozen frame there for a second. So
okay,
maybe that last sentence over again. I was just reminding people to pick up your book and to find you online.
gotcha. The tendency for Christians to be moral and legal perfectionists
Hmm.
is both understandable but also dangerous
Yeah.
because I'll just say, because with restorative justice and especially harm reduction, um, I think there's a way in which there's kind of like, well, there's certain things that we can do or certain things that we can know, and then there's other things that we can't
Hmm.
do or know, either because of there are other moral principles that come into play, or something, and and so harm reduction is meaningful. I think
Hmm.
as a country we are discussing that when it comes to drug use, for instance. That certainly is mostly self-harm, right? And so how do we do harm reduction as opposed and put it into the social welfare and public health category as opposed to the criminal justice category? um, you know, I'm all for legalizing marijuana and probably some other drugs. I need to study that a bit more, but in principle, that doesn't mean that I'm for using substances or abusing substances. It means that I want to take
Yeah.
a public health social welfare approach to it, and there are ways to do that. So does it mean that we can eliminate the abuse of substances? Well, probably not. But given given that, right, like
Yeah.
that's what's going to happen. So I would just say, that is one of the paradigms here for approaching abortion and all of the issues that Christians tend to worry about when it comes to thinking about abortion, which
Yeah.
is like,
Right.
well, if I say yes to contraception, then am I really saying yes to young people having sex promiscuously? Well, uh, so so no, that's not what we're saying. We at least that's not what I'm saying. The issue is we want to reduce harm, and there's going to
Yes.
be limits on what we can do, and that's understandable. Um, but the paradigm, there's a couple paradigms that I think that Christians really need to wrestle with, which is ever since Reagan joined the anti-abortion cause to anti-communism, I think it really has been self-defeating. And what I mean, and this is important, because what I mean by that is the earlier wave of Catholic uh, uh,
Hmm.
pro-lifers, like during the 30s, they saw the abortion rate spike during the Great Depression,
Hmm.
because of course people
Yeah.
they're scared about bringing kids into the world if they have no hope. So the Catholics believe that that poverty drives the abortion rate. In the 80s, Protestants switched that relationship
Right.
and thought that poverty should be the looming threat, the stick motivation that should be there for people if they have sex before they're ready, if they have a kid before they're ready. Like parenting should be tough if you don't conduct yourself properly, right? I mean,
Yeah.
that was
Right.
essentially joining abortion to capitalism, like you get what you deserve type of thinking, as
Hmm.
opposed to thinking about the child and saying, how do we reduce the harm to the child? Like what in the world has the child done to deserve all of the consequences that their parents and
Hmm.
grandparents have experienced and in some cases chosen? So that paradigm shift is really important.
Boy, it really
um,
is. Yeah.
and I am that's why I think, ever since uh, Reagan's presidency, the anti-abortion cause has been joined to capitalism and criminalization, because that's what Reagan was about, and
Hmm.
those are the sensibilities that got really strongly injected into the anti-abortion movement is
Yeah. A law and order
capitalism and
narrative.
criminalization.
Mako, that is so insightful. Thank you for that. And what you're seeing now in the current conversation, and it feels like deep hypocrisy when people say, well, abortion shouldn't be legal, it should be made illegal, but we don't think you should charge the mother with a crime if she aborts the pregnancy, or the pregnant person. You shouldn't charge the pregnant person with a crime
Right.
if they abort the pregnancy. People say, Well, how can it be illegal? And then the person who's, part of it doesn't act on it. Like if you think it's murder, why aren't they charged with murder? And the people are like, no, 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 we don't want anything to do with that. The former failed presidential candidate and twice impeached, now under criminal investigation president, said, "Oh yeah, no, I think women should be criminally charged during the campaign, right?" So he's all over the place, and
Right,
lots of people
right,
feel this way, like they're. But the new movement is maybe charge the doctor with a crime. So make the criminal justice statutes apply to providers,
right.
but not to pregnant people. And folks are saying, like, what sense does that make? But I think they're wrestling with what you're raising here. Like the criminal justice system is not the mechanism by which to deal with these kinds of moral issues. Can we
Right.
deal with it in some other way, some other, you've suggested a health and welfare kind of approach, or a wellness healing approach, restorative approach. But you can see that in the country, we're now wrestling with this because all of a sudden, after the Dobbs decision, this thing is now thrown to states who had these trigger laws go into effect. And then the question became, well, what happens if someone has an abortion in Texas? Is somebody going to be charged with a crime? And then they tried to turn it into a civil lawsuit thing where someone can be uh, sued for $10,000 for help. Like they turned it into capitalism punishment. So you can see that even the pro-life, anti-abortion movement doesn't want to see the ramifications of this as if it fits the other language that they use about other things, right? They,
That's right.
if a person were to, you know, it's hard for me to even say this, but end the life of their child 2 days after the child was born, they wouldn't be like, well, I don't know, don't do anything to the birthing parent about that, right? No, they would totally want to. But if the person terminates that pregnancy at 9 weeks, it's still illegal. But they're like, but don't put the person in jail. So they're even marking that there's a difference, right? And you can
Right,
call this out as hypocrisy, but it's more than hypocrisy. It's we don't know how to talk about this stuff. We don't know how to deal with it. And our systems for
right,
dealing
right,
with it are inadequate. And let's make sure we don't, my view is, let's make sure we don't fault on the wrong, uh, on more damage being done. And I grant the people that I love and care about, we disagree on this. They're like, the only thing I want to tell you is I'm going to list the number of abortions and call it, number of murders a year. The murder rate in this country is whatever percent higher or something. I'm like, okay,
right,
I don't see it that way. And clearly none of you do either, because you're not all calling for, charges to be brought. So it's a confusing place where our social
right,
policy options are so limited to the ethical, moral
right,
spaces we find ourselves in.
right. Absolutely. One, I think one serious thing that I'm wrestling with and thinking about, it comes from a study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, which shows that men in the Rust Belt are less likely to, who've lost their jobs or like their jobs were shipped overseas, to China or other places, were less likely to propose in marriage, right, to their girlfriends.
Hmm.
Now, um, that that is a part of social policy. It's why I believe we should have an industrial policy as opposed to just uh, you know have corporate leaders ship jobs to wherever it's cheapest. So the what it suggests is for those men who are not proposing to uh, their girlfriends ostensibly, are they having any less sex? Like, I doubt it. I doubt it. And so from a social standpoint, what if we thought about it this way? What if the amount of sex that people are having actually stays constant, roughly?
Hmm.
And what we could do best with policy is to shape the conditions under which marriage and childbearing become attractive, right? They become affordable.
Hmm.
They it's like yeah, it's just attractive. And what if that's the best
Hmm.
thing we could do? I think that's a paradigm shift because I think many Christians want to use public policy in such a way to force monasticism on people, right? Like until they get married. Like
Right.
you absolutely should not have premarital sex, and if you do, there should be consequences because of XYZ. And again, I understand, and I'm a Christian minister, and I hope that it is true, right, that people do exercise more thinking. They're uh, are more driven by their values than their sexual desires, and so I do think I do hope that people make choices like that.
Yeah.
However, I also know that it takes a lot of spiritual formation and a lot of healthy relationship in order for that, for people to make choices like that.
Yeah.
And do I think the American church is offering that to people? No.
No.
So
No.
do I so what's the safer assumption to make? I think it is, let's just assume that the amount of sex that people are having out there as a society is basically constant.
Right.
And what we could do is to shape uh, uh,
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
everything such that marriage, long-lasting marriage, is meaningful. Like why we should have a what's it, a 4-day week, because we don't have enough time for people to be with one another, right? Like
Yeah,
just to
I have little
just to
theories about
hang
why we
out.
don't have as somebody who kind of works for themselves and works from home, and a lot of people who've now done this working from home, we're like, oh, I make myself work 7 days a week. Like I could have a 4-day
Right,
work week.
right,
But I don't. You know why? Because I'm bored with my life some days, and I like work more than I like the other thing. Like we have a whole lot of issues that force us into. Like there's a lot of things going on around all these issues as you're raising here that keep us living in ways that people are like, I don't know why we're. Workaholism is a self-driven problem, not just your boss needs you to be in the office 5 days a week kind of problem.
that's right.
The,
I
I
call it
think you're
internalized capitalism, Doug.
Yes, yeah. There's a taskmaster in your brain driving you to
Right,
to stay busy and check your email and check your phone and you know, what have you done for me lately? That voice is
yeah,
not just coming from your supervisor; it's coming from your super ego, and
right,
that's a whole thing But what I think you're getting at is okay. We've got a society that just we don't know how to talk about sex. We don't know how to talk about intimacy.
right,
The old joke. If you want to reduce the amount of sex people are having, have them get married. That'll do it, right? That old
right,
joke. Um, so we don't know how to talk about this. People don't talk about it with each other. We don't talk about it publicly. There's a lot of formed opinions and then a
right.
lot of power used to put some opinions into public spaces and to restrict others. So we're in this power dynamic and it's complicated. And what we've seen now is there's been a flip in the power dynamic around abortion. I know we have to run here because we've been at it for an hour and 18 minutes. Um,
Right.
but there's been a flip in the power dynamic when people who were against abortion were screaming change the law, and now people who want to allow people to terminate pregnancies are having to say change the law, and that
Right.
power dynamic has shifted, and I believe the next 20 years is going to look radically different than the previous 20 years around this issue. I'm not sure we're going to end up in a better place in 2042 at the end of all of this. But let's hope. Let's hope that somehow,
Yeah.
as a conscious community of citizens, we can be in a place where we're not just doing the same conversation that we were having in 1972. Because honestly, Mako, it is just sad to me that
Right.
the framework and the details and the fabric of the conversation that we can have today are only marginally, just slightly different, just a faded color version of what
Yeah.
people were having before the Roe versus Wade decision in 1972. We spent 5 decades not getting any better at this conversation, and I just hope we don't spend the next 2 to 5 decades being as bad at this. And if we're going to get any better, it's because everyone's going to buy abortion policy and Christian social ethics in the United States. So,
Well,
any
thanks for
any
that
final
plug.
words for us?
Yeah, and thanks so much, Doug. I again really appreciate this opportunity to chat with you publicly. I will say there are a lot of folks for whom the book is daunting, and so I did a 3-week um, Zoom class with Q&A and some blog post readings before and after in July, and I put that all on my website. And so for folks, they can go look at anastasiscenter.org, ANASTASIS center.org,
It's like
and
spelling
they'll be able to
Mississippi.
find that. Yeah.
uh, and
uh,
they can also look up your name. They can look up this book. It'll find them to all those places. If they can Google one thing, they can Google all that they need to get there. And
yes.
so podcast people can look in the show notes, as they say in podcast world, and other people can
Yes.
find your name listed here and Google that. And I've been on the website. It's terrific. It's a great resource for people. And especially if you're wanting to have this conversation with someone else
Mhm.
and you don't even know how to begin talking about it, it's a great way to watch some of these pieces and read some of these uh, shorter pieces rather than the full book, and get yourself moving.
That's right. Doug, thanks so much. I
Yeah,
so
you are
appreciate it. And
welcome.
I hope this conversation it helps many, many people. Would love to do more of a deep dive into, some of
For
the
sure, let's
relationship
do it.
between abortion and poverty and abortion and criminal justice. But this has been so valuable. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, my friend. All right, all. Hey, thanks for being with us today. We really appreciate you being around and giving us a little time. And we will see you all next week, but not on Monday because it's Labor Day. Sort of a no pun intended moment there, but we'll see you on Labor Day or after Labor Day. All right, everybody. So,
Bye
bye.
bye.